Let's dive into Slavoj Žižek's The Plague of Fantasies, a text where he weaves together psychoanalysis, Marxist theory, and cultural critique to explore how ideology operates not just as a set of explicit beliefs, but as a structure of desire, fantasy, and enjoyment. This book is quintessential Žižek, brimming with examples from pop culture, philosophy, and politics to illuminate his complex ideas. So, let's unpack its core arguments and take a look at how they resonate in our everyday lives. Žižek starts from the premise that fantasies aren't just daydreams or escapes from reality. They're structural components of how we experience and interpret the world. Drawing on Lacanian psychoanalysis, he suggests that fantasy functions as a kind of support for our reality, giving coherence to our desires and mediating the contradictions of our social and political world. For instance, take consumer capitalism. Why do we buy things we don't really need? It's not about the object itself, but the fantasy it promises. The perfect lifestyle, happiness, or identity that's sold along with the product. Žižek uses this to argue that fantasy isn't separate from ideology. It's central to how ideology works. One of the book's most provocative ideas is its critique of cynicism. You might think that people who are skeptical of power structures or openly mock them are outside ideology. But Žižek argues that cynicism is, paradoxically, the ultimate form of ideological participation. Take someone who knows their political leaders are corrupt, or that their job is exploitative but continues to vote or work as if these systems are inevitable. This knowing participation is still ideological because it keeps the system intact. Žižek's point is that even when we see through ideology, we are often trapped in it at the level of fantasy and enjoyment. Žižek also engages deeply with Marxist theory, particularly the concept of commodity fetishism, which he reinterprets through Lacanian psychoanalysis. A fetish, in this sense, isn't just a sexual obsession, but something that fills a void in our understanding. In capitalism, commodities seem to possess magical properties. Think of how we imbue a designer handbag or a new smartphone with meaning far beyond its functional use. Žižek argues that this fetishism conceals the social relations and exploitation behind production. Here's where fantasy comes in. It smooths over the cracks in our understanding, letting us enjoy the illusion while ignoring the messy realities beneath. Another crucial theme in The Plague of Fantasies is how ideology shapes our sense of agency. Žižek challenges the notion that we're free individuals making rational choices. Instead, our decisions are shaped by the symbolic order, the web of cultural norms, language, and social structures that frame what we perceive as possible or desirable. He uses examples from cinema to illustrate this point, like the way romantic comedies create a fantasy of love as inevitable destiny. We might not believe in these narratives consciously, but they still structure how we think about relationships and what we expect from them. Žižek also tackles the role of enjoyment, or jouissance, in sustaining ideology. Ideology isn't just about imposing rules or beliefs. It's about regulating our pleasures and anxieties. For instance, think about the rituals of patriotism, national anthems, flags, and public holidays. These aren't just symbols. They're infused with a kind of collective enjoyment that binds people to the nation-state, even if they're critical of its policies. This enjoyment is what makes ideology so effective. It's not just something we're subjected to. It's something we participate in, often willingly. One of Žižek's more unsettling arguments is that fantasy isn't just personal. It's political. Fantasies can mask social antagonisms, but they can also escalate them. He examines nationalism as a case study, showing how fantasies of purity and unity are used to justify exclusion or violence against perceived outsiders. For Žižek, these fantasies aren't just delusions. They have real consequences, shaping policies and fueling conflicts. This ties into his broader critique of the postmodern condition, where truth becomes fragmented and power operates through the proliferation of competing narratives. Žižek's writing often circles back to the question of what it means to confront the real, the unfiltered, raw core of existence that fantasy and ideology help us avoid. He argues that true liberation requires a confrontation with this real, a process that's deeply unsettling because it involves dismantling the fantasies that give our lives coherence. This is why Žižek emphasizes the role of critique, not just as an intellectual exercise, but as a way to disrupt the smooth functioning of ideology and open up new possibilities for action. To confront the real, Žižek argues, is to face the gaps and contradictions that ideology conceals, a deeply unsettling but necessary act. The real, in Lacanian terms, resists symbolization. It's the traumatic kernel of existence that ideology papers over with comforting fantasies. These fantasies, however, aren't just ideological superstructures imposed on us. They are actively sustained by our desires. Žižek pushes us to recognize this complicity. The ideological edifice isn't just out there. It operates through us, through our unconscious acceptance of its logic. This insight is central to the Plague of Fantasies. Žižek examines how ideology isn't merely about deception or manipulation, but about structuring reality itself. Fantasies provide a coherent, livable world by masking the fundamental inconsistencies in our socio-political systems. These fantasies manifest in everyday life, from consumer culture to political discourse, ensuring that we can function without confronting the real's traumatic nature. Take, for example, the fantasy of choice in capitalism. We feel free because we can choose between countless products, but this masks the unfreedom of the system that constrains those choices. Žižek's analysis moves beyond a mere critique of consumerism to dissect how even dissent is often co-opted by ideology. Consider the commodification of rebellion. Wearing a Che Guevara t-shirt, for instance, becomes an act that paradoxically reinforces the very system it ostensibly opposes. Here, Žižek illustrates how fantasy operates not only in support of dominant ideologies, but also within resistance, often neutralizing its radical potential. The challenge Žižek presents is twofold. First, we must identify these fantasies, which is no easy task given their pervasiveness and emotional hold. Second, we must confront the real, the traumatic kernel of antagonism and contradiction that fantasies obscure. For Žižek, this confrontation is a prerequisite for true freedom, which he defines not as the absence of constraints, but as the capacity to act outside the confines of ideological fantasy. This process is deeply unsettling, as it requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our complicity in the systems we critique. Take the political sphere. The fantasy of democracy often hinges on the idea that citizens have meaningful control over governance. Žižek exposes this as a fantasy masking the reality of systemic inequalities and elite control. Yet he doesn't advocate cynicism. Rather, he calls for a radical rethinking of democracy itself, one that addresses these antagonisms rather than concealing them. Žižek also delves into the cultural realm, where fantasies proliferate in media, art, and popular culture. A blockbuster film might serve as an escapist fantasy, but it also reinforces certain ideological frameworks about heroism, power, and morality. Žižek's method often involves a close reading of such cultural artifacts to reveal their ideological underpinnings. This approach not only makes his critique accessible, but also demonstrates the omnipresence of ideology in shaping our desires and perceptions. Confronting the real doesn't mean abandoning fantasy altogether, an impossible task, as fantasy is integral to human subjectivity. Rather, Žižek advocates for what he calls a traversing of the fantasy, understanding and confronting the ideological frameworks that structure our desires without succumbing to them. This traversal allows for a more honest engagement with the complexities of human existence and the antagonisms of our socio-political systems. Ultimately, the Plague of Fantasies is a call to critique not only the systems of power, but also the fantasies that sustain them. It's an invitation to think critically about our desires, our beliefs, and the ways in which we participate in ideological systems. Žižek doesn't offer easy solutions or utopian visions. Instead, he provides a framework for navigating the contradictions of modern life. By exposing the fantasies that shape our reality, Žižek hopes to open a space for genuine transformation, an uncomfortable but necessary step toward true freedom. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Slavoj Žižek's The Plague of Fantasies. This book challenges us to confront not only the ideological structures around us, but also the fantasies we cling to, offering a powerful framework for understanding the complexities of our world. If today's discussion resonated with you, I encourage you to engage with the material directly. Let's continue exploring these challenging ideas together. Don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts. Thank you for your time and curiosity.